Hey there, it's Tank Girl, and this here is the Moto X for 2014. It's improved in every way from last year's Moto X, and as you know, I wasn't a big fan myself, although I did appreciate some of the things about it. It was a pretty popular phone, particularly in terms of ergonomics, last year's Moto X, and a lot of that had to do with its size. It was a small phone with little bezel with a 4.7-inch 720p display. This year we're dealing with a large phone, 5.2 inches, still very little bezel, but it does make the phone significantly bigger, and even though it has the same delightful ergonomics as last year's, it is going to be too big for many people. But for me it's pretty damn perfect in terms of size. So that's the biggest difference, the size compared to last year. Of course, spec-wise last year was a bit of a disappointment. The Moto X for 2013 basically had a dual-core Snapdragon S4 Pro-ish type level performance on board instead of a Snapdragon 800, which is what you'd expect last year for a flagship. But this doesn't skimp. You're getting a Snapdragon 801 this year, again with 2 gigs of RAM. So basically, again, improved in every way. It's a 5.2-inch display. It's AMOLED, but it's 1080p this time instead of 720, so 1080 by 1920. So that's a big improvement, and you really notice it. This display is really gorgeous. I know you can see it here in the video, and I'll give you a closer look. In terms of the look and feel, again, this is very much like last year's Moto X, with that little dimple to put your finger to hold the phone, the camera pod in the back. But what's changed significantly is that the entire edge of the phone is made of metal this year, and that makes the phone feel so much more delightful to me. So that's a big improvement, I think. Last year's Moto X felt a little too plasticky to me. Again, I think in terms of ergonomics, it really hit the spot last year, but the specs and the build and the materials just left a lot to be desired for a flagship. And you know, you can argue that perhaps it wasn't trying to be a flagship, but I believe this really does feel like a flagship. There's a couple of things missing for this to really hit the mark and to make this device my daily driver. This is an AT&T phone, of course, so I would never buy a locked device. This is just the review unit that I've gotten. There is a Pure Edition that you can buy that's unlocked and has very much the same stock Android experience, but minus all the AT&T apps, which I've actually disabled on this phone. So the Pure Edition is the one you want, but again, there's two things that are going to miss the mark for me and potentially for you as well. One is battery life. It is not that great, and it wasn't that great last year. Secondly, camera. It is an improvement over last year significantly, but it's still not good enough. So I've given you the basic specs. Snapdragon 801, 2 gigs of RAM. This particular model has 16 gigs of built-in storage with no micro SD expansion. There's a 32 gig version. You probably want to upgrade to that version. And yes, it does look like stereo speakers here, but it is not. Actually, this is just an earpiece and this is just a mono speaker, which is disappointing because the Moto G for 2014 does use both of its speakers for stereo audio. This is a really, really gorgeous display. It's really beautiful. I mean, it's a little oversaturated like most AMOLEDs, but frankly, I think it's one of the nicest displays I've come across this year. Icons really just literally seem to float on the display, and that just makes me really happy. So you've got the speaker grill, some sensors, and a front-facing camera here. And then on the bottom you have, as I said, the main speaker, which is not a stereo set. And then the buttons are in software like last year. And then on the side here, starting at the top, you have the SIM card slot. That's a nano SIM again. Headphone jack, and you can see here the little plastic dividers baked into the metal frame to create the antenna isolation points, and you can see at the bottom here again where the micro USB charge and data port is located, and again these little plastic bands baked into the metal. Anyway, on the right hand side you have the power lock button, which is textured, feels really nice, it's metal, a volume rocker, and then on the left hand side you really have nothing at all here. On the back, you have a 13 megapixel camera this year versus 10 last year, and better yet, the f-stop is better. It's f/2.2 versus f/2.6, and you can see the dual LED flash is actually a flash ring, which arguably for close-up shots is probably an improvement. I told you that battery life is kind of a bit of a disappointment, and that's because The battery's only improved marginally. It's 2300 milliamp hour versus 2200 milliamp hour last year. So where you'd think with a Snapdragon 801 you'd get a really good battery life, but that's really not the case. The camera is also missing the spot for me despite being a huge improvement. 13 megapixels better, f/2.2 is better, but it's missing the mark as a flagship because it does not have OIS. And in my opinion, optical image stabilization is a must-have today in a flagship. So speaking of phones, let's compare this to last year's Moto X. I have the 2013 here. This is my personal, customized, as you can see, purple with pink keys Moto X, which I really love. And so you can immediately notice the size difference here. This is 2014 with this 2013. 5.2 inches versus 4.7 inches, 1080p versus 720p, both AMOLED, but really it's night and day. Flipping them over, you can see the similarity in designs here. The DNA kind of remains. You have the little dimple on both of them. They look very similar, and you can see how the design language has evolved. In terms of thickness, they are very similar. I mean, they're both not thin phones, but it's really a matter of how they feel in your hand. The edges are much thinner on this year's Moto X than last year's, which I think makes it feel even better. But here you can see the size comparison in terms of thickness. As you notice, there is this new feature where you can just hover above the display like this, and it turns on and shows you any notifications you have. So they've improved on some of these custom software features that existed on last year's Moto X. You know, everything here is just the standard kind of stock, almost Nexus-like experience. So if you get the Pure Edition, as I suggested, you'll be well served. This is a Moto G for this year, and you can immediately see the difference in size. They're actually almost identical. The Moto G is taller than the Moto X, but narrower. And it's a 5-inch IPS panel versus a 5.2-inch AMOLED, and it's 720p instead of 1080p. So of course that's a big difference. Last year was 4.7 versus 4.5, and this year's 5.2 versus 5.0. But the stereo speakers on the Moto G are actually stereo speakers, which is really quite cool. And then, you know, if you flip them over, design similarities abound here. You have the dimple in the back. This looks more like last year's Moto X actually than even the Moto G. And then in terms of thickness, they're very similar. Moto's gone with the similar design and layout, but the Moto X has the thinner edges than the Moto G and last year's Moto X and G. Anyway, this wouldn't be complete if I didn't show you a comparison with my favorite and my daily driver phone, the Nexus 5. This is a Nexus 5. It's getting a bit old now, but it's still one of the best phones. And as you can see, it's a 5-inch display with very little bezel. And very much impressive to see that the Moto X is 5.2 inches and almost the same size, which means that it's even less bezel, really. Anyway, there they are. Of course, I'm running Lollipop on the Nexus, which is, you know, a nice thing to have. Hasn't landed on this AT&T Moto X yet, the Lollipop update, sadly. Anyway, so that's the comparison with the Nexus 5. You can look at the back here. Very similar soft touch finish here. 8 megapixel OIS camera. I cannot emphasize how significant and critical OIS is on phones today. And then thickness wise, if I stack them together, obviously the Nexus 5 is going to look thicker because it doesn't have those tapered edges, but really it's thinner, and it's just more rectangular and square of a design. So I hope you enjoyed my review. Please follow me on Twitter. I'm Tankgirl, TNKGRL. You can also find my blog, tankgirl.com, again, TNKGRL.com. And keep tuned to subscribe and like this video on YouTube so that you can keep in touch with my other videos. I've got a whole bunch coming up, so stay tuned. All right, cheers.